When John and Caroline Lived in the White House by Lori Coulter. This is a little bit of a longer book, I believe, but we'll still read it. This is the story of Caroline and John Kennedy Jr., the children of President John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline. They lived in the White House from February 1961 until November of 1963, a brief but unforgettable time in American history. A snowman on the lawn. There's lots of room to play, and a great big garden, too, Caroline said after moving into the White House. Mrs. Kennedy asked the White House gardeners to build a snowman for the children's arrival. Caroline skipped down the airplane steps and ran into her mother's arms. Nanny Maud Shaw followed slowly, carrying tiny 2-month-old John Jr. As snowflakes swirled around them, John and Jacqueline Kennedy quickly led their family across the tarmac and into a waiting limousine. Sandwiched between her parents in the back seat, Caroline chatted happily about all the things she had done at her grandparents' house in Palm Beach, Florida. The 3-year-old had weeks of news to tell her father. The last time she had seen him was on television. On January 20th, 1961, she had watched as her father was sworn in as President of the United States. Now Caroline's family was together again, but best of all, today they were moving into their new home. As the limousine turned off Pennsylvania Avenue into the White House grounds, a staff policeman opened the southwest gate with a smile. At the end of the drive, Caroline could see the presidential mansion. It shone like a snow palace. And right outside, a snowman stood guard with open arms, as if welcoming Caroline and John to the most famous house in the world. The Kennedy family in the limousine on the way to their new home. (1600) Pennsylvania Avenue. It was difficult on the children at first, especially during the first 3 months when we barely saw them. It almost broke my heart, Mrs. Kennedy said. The new family pauses at the southwest entrance. That's the picture here. The southwest entrance. Let's see, this one says, Caroline liked taking care of her baby brother, who sometimes napped in his carriage on the Truman balcony. J. Bernard West, the chief usher of the White House, shook hands with Caroline at the southwest entrance. As always, he was very calm and dignified, even though his staff had been in an uproar for weeks. They had been helping Mrs. Kennedy redecorate the family quarters on the second floor in time for the children's arrival. A young family hadn't lived there for 50 years, and it showed. As Mr. West and the Kennedys stepped off the elevator, though, no signs of the dismal dark walls and ugly furniture remained. A pale pink and white room waited for Caroline, a bright blue and white nursery for John, and a bedroom between the two for Miss Shaw. A small dining room, kitchen, and pantry had been added as well. Caroline's mother had thought of everything, even a wicker wastebasket for Miss Shaw's banana peels. Even so, like any new house, the White House seemed strange at first. Mrs. Kennedy complained that it was like living in a hotel. A butler, a maid, and a cook had worked for the Kennedys in their Georgetown house, but hundreds of people bustled about the White House. Unfamiliar faces kept popping in and out of the family's rooms, carrying sheets and towels, balancing silver trays of food, bringing messages and folders to Caroline's parents. It was a very busy place. President Kennedy and Caroline visit Miss Shaw and John in his new bedroom. Caroline owned a large Raggedy Ann doll like this one called Mother Annie. In a later photograph of the children taken in Caroline's room, the doll's head pokes up behind the red and white love seat. Oh, there it is, I see it. Robin, the canary, looks on from his cage. There's all her dolls and toys. There's John. Caroline enjoyed playing with her baby brother in her new bedroom. By bedtime, Mr. West and most of the staff had left for the night. In the black quiet of Caroline's room, the walls soared up into the darkness and disappeared. Although her canopy bed made a cozy space within the enormous bedroom, Caroline asked Miss Shaw to leave her door open. When the nanny asked why, she said, "Oh, Miss Shaw, I always feel that if you close the door, maybe you won't be able to open it again quickly if I want you." Miss Shaw understood. "All right, darling, we'll leave it open. You know I'll come if you call." Working in the White House, 70 men and women, from doormen and maids to cooks and carpenters, worked for J.B. West, the chief usher. He and his staff looked after the central part of the 132-room mansion, from the staterooms on the first floor to the 6 guest bedrooms on the third floor. 300 people, from aides and press officers to secretaries and telephone operators, worked with President Kennedy in the West Wing and Mrs. Kennedy in the East Wing. 200 special police officers and a squad of Secret Service agents protected the White House and the First Family. Oh, this is their chef. Okay, he makes their meals. Secret Service agent, Bob Foster. The center is the chief usher, so he's in charge of the staff, like running the White House. And Mrs. Kennedy's press secretary, Pam Turner, with Caroline's cat, Tom Kitten. JFK and Jackie sun masks, and the Caroline doll, right here, joined a long list of toys, records, and games about the First Family. Caroline, holding a picture of her father, poses like a movie star. Kennedy mania. I don't want them to think they are official children. When I go out with them or when they go out with their nurse, please ask the doormen not to hover around to open the doors for them. Mrs. Kennedy gives instructions to Mr. West. Once they moved into the White House, Caroline and John became as famous as the house they lived in. More than 1 million people a year began touring the White House in 1961, hoping to catch a glimpse of them, their handsome father or their glamorous mother. 300 fan letters a day poured into the East Wing. What kind of baby food did Jacqueline Kennedy feed her son? They asked, and what color lipstick did she wear? One fan even sent a portrait of Jackie made of sticky caramel corn with a red nail polish smile. Every week, dolls and toy horses for Caroline and stuffed animals for John filled the mailroom. Real animals began arriving as well, including Zaza the rabbit. She apparently could play a few notes of the Star-Spangled Banner on a toy horn and liked to drink beer. Mrs. Kennedy's staff patiently answered each letter and gave the toys to a children's hospital and the animals to the zoo. All this attention could have been overwhelming, but Mrs. Kennedy wanted a simple, unspoiled, normal life for Caroline and John, away from the intruding cameras of photographers and tourists. She set up a school in the third-floor sunroom of the White House for Caroline's playgroup and from the family's old neighborhood. Then she designed a private playground for the children under the trees near the president's office. "Let's put in a trampoline right there," she suggested to Mr. West, "and hide it somehow, please. After the gardeners planted a tall holly trees around the trampoline," she said, "oh, this will be perfect. Now when I jump on the trampoline, all they'll be able to see is my head sailing above the treetops." "Good morning, Miss Shaw." Only after we had taken the smoothly operated elevator to the second floor did I feel that we were away from it all in our own little kingdom, Miss Shaw. By the end of Caroline and John's first year in the White House, their family had settled into a daily routine. Step on a crack, break your mother's back. President Kennedy helps Caroline jump over cracks along the West Wing's colonnade and plays with John outside the Oval Office. In 1962, more than 46 million Americans watched Mrs. Kennedy's one-hour television tour of the White House. In it, the First Lady showed viewers the beautiful antiques she and her committee had collected for the staterooms. 7 to 9:30. Early every morning, the children visited Miss Shaw in her room, ate breakfast in the upstairs kitchen, then scooted down the hallway to their father's room. By that time, President Kennedy had eaten his own breakfast and read 6 newspapers and several government reports. He could read 2,400 words a minute. They watched cartoons on television or played with little toy ducks and pigs in their father's bathwater. After leaving John with Mrs. Kennedy, Caroline and the president walked to his office in the West Wing. 9:30 to 12:30. At 9:30, Caroline joined her friends in the schoolroom for the morning. Mrs. Kennedy took John outside for an hour, then worked at her desk until lunch. She wrote letters, planned dinners for important visitors, and worked on her special project, redecorating the White House. Miss Shaw took John to play in his room or in the wide center hall upstairs. 12:30 to 1:30. Until Caroline began to go to school for the entire day, the children ate lunch upstairs with Mrs. Kennedy or had a picnic on the south lawn. 1:30 to 3. After a dip in the indoor pool, President Kennedy arrived home for his lunch and a nap. The staff left the family apartment, the phone stopped ringing, and the children and their parents slept. John is a bad, squeaky boy who tries to spit in his mother's Coca-Cola and who has a very bad temper. Caroline writes a letter to her grandmother, Rose Kennedy. The south lawn was the perfect place to play on the swings or have a picnic. Mrs. Kennedy enjoyed finding places for her children to play and even wondered if the White House bomb shelter could be used for a basketball court. Three to 6. In the afternoon, Caroline and John played upstairs or out on the playground. Sometimes they watched a movie with friends in their own private theater in the basement of the East Wing. And on hot days, they waded in the South Fountain, the best wading pool in the city, squealing as the cool gushes of water splashed over their heads. Caroline, shown here playing in the family quarters upstairs, liked Bambi so much that her mother asked Mr. West if they could keep deer on the grounds. But the National Zoo told him that the deer would be able to jump over the White House fence. 6 to 6:30. The children ate dinner with Miss Shaw. During her second week in the White House, Caroline had turned up her nose at the meals made by the chefs. Liver 3 times in 4 days. Fortunately, Miss Shaw planned the meals after that. If something new was served, she simply said, "Now you just try 1 spoonful. Even if you really don't like it, leave the rest. But the next time you have it, try 2 spoonfuls. Even spinach soon disappeared from the children's plates using the English nanny's technique. 6:30 to 8. Mrs. Kennedy read to Caroline and John after their dinner. Sometimes she let them take a bubble bath in her bathroom as a special treat. While their mother put on dressy clothes for dinner with the president and their guests, Caroline and John tumbled about her room. On other days, the children joined their father for his evening swim. Or If no official guests were dining with them, the Kennedys and their friends liked to watch the latest Hollywood movies. Caroline and John were allowed to watch until bedtime. 8 p.m. Miss Shaw read stories to the children and helped them say their prayers. Then their parents came in to give them a good night kiss and tuck them into bed. During their games of tag in the pool, John liked to call his father silly names like Foo-Foo Head. Reporters once heard the president calling his son John, John, and assumed his son's nickname was John John, but it wasn't. Thank you for the world so sweet. Thank you for the food we eat. Thank you for the birds that sing. Thank you, God, for everything. Miss Shaw taught this prayer to Caroline and John. In his room before bedtime, John plays with his mother's pearl necklace and shakes hands with the large toy nutcracker. Caroline is still wearing one of the costumes from her dress-up box. On another evening, Miss Shaw waits for the president and John to return from the Oval Office. School on the third floor. Somebody's been up here making the biggest mess, and it's not the first time either. Something is going on in this nursery school at night, Miss Grimes complains to Mr. West. The young teacher, Miss Grimes, stared at the sand scattered around the shiny linoleum floor. Caroline's cat, Tom Kitten, had never liked the White House, and now lived with the president's secretary, so he hadn't made the mess. The rabbits were nibbling lettuce in their cages. Caroline's escape artist hamsters, Billy and Debbie, rarely scampered beyond the president's bathroom. And Charlie, the Welsh Terrier, slept in a room on the ground floor, so who was it? After talking to Miss Grimes, the chief usher asked one of the maids to come into his office. Did she know who or what was digging in the sandbox? It's just Mrs. Kennedy and Caroline, she replied with a smile. They come up here at night and play in the sand. In the end, nobody could blame them. The schoolroom's big sandbox, as well as its spectacular view and shelves of books, toys, and art supplies, made it the best playroom in the house. Mrs. Kennedy joins her daughter and a friend above, crayoning at a table. Caroline's crayons opposite. Caroline stands fifth from the left in the second row of her school photo. Fifth from the left in the second row. How do you tell if there's an elephant in your refrigerator? By the footprints in the pudding. Children told lots of elephant jokes in the 1960s. Caroline sews, answers a question, and reads in the classroom. This is their Halloween party. The space race. On April 12, 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth. Although President Kennedy congratulated the Soviet Union on its outstanding technical accomplishment, he and other Americans feared that the Soviets would soon dominate the Earth from space. They hurried to catch up, sending Alan Shepard into space on May 5, 1961. After this success, President Kennedy vowed to put a man on the moon before the decade was over. The American space program moved into high gear, and on February 20th, 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. Astronaut John Glenn shows President Kennedy the Mercury Atlas 6 spacecraft in which he orbited the Earth 3 times. The children always welcomed visitors to their school, whether a group of Native Americans in traditional costumes or parents for a picnic. In the spring of 1962, the 10 children in Caroline's playgroup were ready for nursery school or kindergarten, depending on their ages. The school expanded to 21 children. To help Miss Grimes, the parents hired another teacher, Jacqueline Hirsch. Mrs. Kennedy asked the teachers not to treat her daughter any differently than the other children. On field trips to museums or to the National Gallery of Art, Caroline's Secret Service agents tagged along, but the two men didn't hold Caroline's hand, and they kept their walkie-talkies out of sight. When her class watched special ceremonies on the South Lawn, Caroline lined up with everybody else. And when they were invited to meet an astronaut, the president's daughter joined the other excited children, reaching out to shake their hero's hand. Pushinka and Charlie. Pushinka, which means fluffy in Russian, joined Charlie at the White House in June 1961. A year earlier, her famous mother, Strelka, had orbited the Earth in the Russian satellite Sputnik. Clearly a space dog's daughter, Pushinka loved launching herself from the playground slide. Charlie, meanwhile, chased the ducks in the fountain or nipped the gardeners as they bent over the flower beds. Charlie and Pushinka had 4 puppies: Blackie, White Tips, Butterfly, and Streaker. The Kennedy dog family had now grown to 9. After Pushinka, 3 more canine gifts arrived: Wolf, an Irish wolfhound, Clipper, a German shepherd, and Shannon, a cocker spaniel. Even for a family of animal lovers, this was too many dogs. Mrs. Kennedy and the press office organized a letter-writing contest. The children were asked to write why they could provide a good home for a Kennedy puppy. 10,000 children entered the contest, and the 2 winners each received a puppy. The remaining 2 puppies were adopted by relatives. Although Charlie, above left, was the Kennedys' first dog, Shannon became the family favorite. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gave Pushinka to Mrs. Kennedy after he met her in Vienna. At the family's summer home in Hyannisport, John and his mother hold Shannon and her 2 puppies, while Clipper stands, Wolf sprawls on the patio, and Charlie plays with Caroline. The Cold War. During the Kennedy years, there was a great tension between the United States with its democratic form of government and the Soviet Union with its communist system. Soviet and American troops didn't fight on a battleground, but both countries spent huge amounts of money building nuclear weapons to use against each other if war began. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev met on June 3, 1961 in Vienna to try and build some trust between their 2 nations. It was after this meeting that Premier Khrushchev sent Pushinka to the Kennedys. Special days. The chopper's coming, Miss Shaw. The chopper's coming, John. Meeting Oval Office visitors was fun, but watching them land in the presidential helicopter was even better. John loved helicopters. Sometimes he and his father would sit at the controls and pretend to fly the chopper together. Mrs. Kennedy and John watched the welcoming party for the president at Algeria. On October 15, 1962, Caroline and her school friends watched the arrival of the first foreign leader ever brought to the White House by helicopter. "Here it comes," they shouted, as the chopper clattered straight toward them. A few minutes later, it had landed like a giant insect on the lawn. President Kennedy stepped forward to welcome His Excellency Ahmed Ben Bella, the President of Algeria. The 2 men stood at attention during the solemn military welcoming ceremony, which included a thunderous 21-gun salute. On the balcony, the excited children marched about loudly, copying the many soldiers parading below. Unfortunately, they didn't stop when the president gave his speech. The next day, an article appeared in the Washington Post newspaper about the children's antics. Poor Miss Grimes and Miss Hirsch, who didn't think their students could be heard, quickly wrote letters of apology to the president. This was one of the few times that his daughter or son embarrassed President Kennedy. The children knew exactly how to behave on formal occasions, boasted Miss Shaw. As soon as they were old enough, Caroline was taught to curtsy and John to bow. An empress comes to call. Before state dinners, the President and Mrs. Kennedy entertained visiting heads of state in the Yellow Oval Room. Like other parents, they liked to introduce their children to their dinner guests. In the past year, John and Caroline had met princes, princesses, governors, and other dignitaries. It was terribly exciting for a little girl to see all the people dressed in their evening dresses glittering with jewelry, said Miss Shaw. The most glittering guest of all arrived on April 11th, 1962, with the visit of the Shah of Iran and his wife Farah Diba, who wore a diamond tiara and a necklace studded with emeralds. On the afternoon of 1962, state dinner for the Iranian royal couple, Mrs. Kennedy introduces the Empress of Iran to John, while Caroline's pony Macaroni looks on. After state dinners, guests watched a show in the East Room. President Kennedy talks to opera singer Grace Bumbry above right after her performance. Foreign trips. I think I'll need to make 2 videos since this is pretty long, so I think I'll stop it here.